Hello, Advanced English Learners. Mary Daphne and Greg here, having a live conversation, and we'd be happy to answer any of your questions if you just throw them in the interactive chat in the margin on the side, or leave a comment down below, which we'll get to as well. So, how are you doing today, Greg?
Doing very well. Thank you for asking.
Good.
How about you?
I'm doing well as well. I'm excited to be having this conversation with you because it's about one of my favorite topics. Communication, obviously, is one of my favorite topics and very passionate about. But, if you think about language learning and why, at least for me, like my incentive for learning other languages was to be able to communicate in them. What about for you?
Yeah, for me, I think it was understanding the culture, right? Contextual positioning.
Yeah, for sure. And the only real way to be able to communicate in a language is to have communicative competence. So we're going to talk a little bit about what communicative competence is. And if you've already seen the video lesson that we put out earlier this week, if not, then check it out because it's all about, the Dell Hymes Speaking Model. And he uses an acronym, it's speaking. So each of those letters stand for something that we need to pay attention to in any type of communication context. So let's start with linguistic competence. Linguistic competence is a term that Noam Chomsky came up with. And it's basically, being able to understand the grammar and vocabulary of a language, right? So think about things like when you read, do you understand the words that you read? When you listen, can you understand what each of those words mean, right? Same thing when you watch something.
Right.
But this is not a complete picture of the language because we realized, right, and not me, but linguists, and I've studied applied linguistics, so at that time, though, in the 60s, linguists realized, and also language teachers, that, talking about just linguistic competence doesn't allow someone to become communicative. It doesn't allow them to communicate. And I'm sure you can think of your own examples, but one that stands out is like when somebody can read but can't speak.
Yeah, that happens all the time. That was very common when I was teaching English in China.
Yeah.
A lot of my students, their reading abilities vastly exceeded their speaking abilities.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure you've run into those situations
For
as
sure.
well.
Yeah. Right. So it's not enough to get us to the point of being able to communicate. Right. Even if you can read the most advanced text or a book. And isn't that funny? So then Dell Hymes came up with this term a couple of years later, communicative competence, which includes linguistic competence, but takes it a step further and says, hold up, it's not just knowing the words. It's knowing when is it appropriate to use those words. And really, like you said, being attuned to the culture.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I like that. You've mentioned the past sort of the pragmatics.
Yes.
It sounds sort of similar, right?
Very much so. Yeah. So within and I have my notes here just so that we don't miss anything. But we have, so under the communicative competence framework, we have a few different competencies, right? Areas that we want to really improve in order to be able to communicate, right? And this is taking into consideration contextual, like the context, right? So cultural context, different types of communication settings. So we have linguistic competence, right? Understanding the code of language from grammar and vocabulary, right? And so that's like the most basic one because when you're learning a language, you're doing vocab acquisition. Okay. Then we have that's a big thing. Sociolinguistic competence.
Right. And by the way, we're using the word competence a lot. Competence basically just means understanding. It's kind of like the combination of understanding and ability, right? Your competence with something is how good is your grasp of that subject.
That's really good. I'm so glad that you define that because we are using it a lot. ability too, right? It's your ability in that area. So sociolinguistic competence. There we go. I said it this time. This one's really about like the sociocultural rules, right? It's
When you hear socio, think of social.
yeah,
right?
society, social interaction. Like, when is it appropriate to wave? Like in the middle of a conversation, or at the beginning or at the end of a conversation, right? Things like that. Like, language use. Like, when is it appropriate to use what, right? The appropriateness of topic, setting, language register, all of that. Also, in terms of like how polite to be, how friendly to be, what are like some social taboos, right? So in American culture, I was really surprised because when I was in France, and I was studying abroad there multiple times, I'm a big Francophile. So that means somebody who loves like that file, right? Bibliophile, love of books. Francophile, love of French culture.
Audiophile, love of music, or really sound.
Yeah. And so I remember at the cafe, like they were talking about, like they were getting into these like really heated discussions, like very tense discussions about like politics and like religion and, things that are kind of a little bit off limits in like people tend to kind of like shy away from those topics unless you're with like really good friends or family, just because it can incite a lot of like emotion. But here they were just like casually talking about it because in French culture, it's not a taboo, right? So that's under that sociolinguistic competence. Okay,
Right.
so far we have two: linguistic, sociocultural, really sociolinguistic, but you can add that culture part in there. And then we have discourse competence. And that's being able to, understand or like, being able to speak and read, being able to like send an email, that kind of thing. How to combine a text, like how to compose an essay, how to formulate an email.
Right. How to structure your ideas.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Into like a cohesive paragraph or essay.
Or narrative.
Yeah.
Yep.
Even like a speech. How can you give a speech? How can you hold a debate? And then we have, actually, this one's, I think, one of my favorites, strategic competence. So do you have any guesses as to what that could be? Strategic competence?
Maybe, for me, I would just think of when to apply what, sort of like what to deploy at what time.
Yeah, that's very, very good. I mean, basically, it's like when you are in the event of a communication breakdown, right? Like you forget a word, you stumble upon your words. And it happens all the time to native speakers too, right? It's not anything to scoff at or to be ashamed of. How do you repair it? Or if something is not clear, how do you ask a clarifying question? How do you repair communication in the event of a breakdown?
Yeah, I feel like that ties into what we were discussing last week in terms of the importance of getting clarity, right? When people use ambiguous language, fuzzy terms,
fuzzy phrases,
right? Seeking clarity on what they're saying,
for sure,
can be a part of that.
Yeah, right. Things like repair, seeking clarity, asking a question, saying, "I didn't catch that. Can you repeat it?" Self-correction, right? Self-repair. So these are 4, and then recently, we've added another one, which is intercultural competence. So what do we mean by that? Being able to navigate a communication setting that is involving people from multiple cultures, even one other culture, where, the norms might be different, which certainly will be different. Language is different. And so how do you prevent miscommunication from happening, in which case you will rely on strategic competence, but you're also relying on discourse competence, linguistic competence, sociolinguistic competence, right? So just to show you that there's so much more than just this one idea of knowing a language, right? We need all of these things to be able to communicate.
Yeah. No, it's great to have a breakdown like this sort of framework.
Yeah.
Because it allows us, I think, to be much more thoughtful about the way we communicate, and when we're communicating, what aspects of communication we're using.
Yeah.
So I find this is really useful to apply, especially when you're advanced in the language. You know, at this point, your challenge isn't vocabulary, right? It isn't grammar. It's more so really understanding fluent usage of the language in a way that comes across as native, right?
Right.
And by understanding a lot of these components, these sort of fundamental but hard to see, almost invisible components of communication,
Yeah.
you can come across as much more fluent
Sure.
and a much higher proficiency and mastery of the language.
Yeah. So, finding ways of increasing your competencies in all of these aspects, right? Being able to self-repair, right? Saying a word again, or say, oh, I actually meant this, or, correcting yourself on the spot. Because native speakers do this too. When they say something, they won't say, oh, I just said something really wrong. What was that? Like, they won't make a big deal out of it. They'll simply repeat it.
Yeah.
And news anchors do this all the time. We were watching a program the other day, and they said something, they made a mistake, native English speaker, and they just repaired it right away. And it goes unnoticed, really, right? So we really encourage you to just practice these different types of competencies so that you can start seeing yourself improve overall in your communication.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of an overview of this. We'll probably go more in depth at some point. We have some other goodies coming your way. So yeah, we want to hear from you. What experience have you had in any of these competencies?
Yeah, have you heard of them before? And if so, what was the context?
Yeah.
And what's your perspective on how to use them?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's it. So we'll see you next week. And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
Have a wonderful day.
We'll see you next time.
Happy learning. Happy advanced English learning.
Indeed.